Hello friends. Although the level and pattern of economic development primarily depends upon the internal conditions of countries, most economists do believe that international trade can substantially contribute towards the development process. So today we are going to examine the relationship between international trade and economic development in a bit detail. We will explore the relationship between trade and economic development, how trade has operated as engine of growth in the case of some of the countries, and also the contribution of trade to development. Welcome to the video. So we will start with the importance of trade to development. Then we will examine the views of trade theory and economic development. Then we will explore the way in which international trade has operated as an engine of growth in the case of what is known as the regions of recent settlements in the 19th century. And we will complete this session with a positive note by examining all important ways through which international trade can still contribute towards the process of economic development today. We will start with a very complex question. Why do countries trade with each other? Over the years, the economists have tried to convince the public as well as policymakers that the countries, like individuals, are not equally capable of producing every commodity or services they want and needs to consume. Then all countries can benefit if each country specializes in the production of those commodities in which it is having a comparative advantage and produce the best compared to others and satisfy their other wants by trading with other countries. Such a specialization and trade will make the global output much higher, much larger than it would be without the international trade. That is, through international trade, all countries can gain as a result of specialization and exchange. Now, trade has been an important mainspring of the growth of the countries at their different stages of development. For example, during 19th century, the countries that were industrializing has the access to food and raw materials in the primary producing countries, which allowed the more developed countries to reap the gains of international specialization. On the contrary, the developing countries were assisted in their development process with the demand for raw material from the developed countries who were experiencing industrial revolution during that period. Today, trade does not seem to work with the equal advantage for the both developed as well as developing countries, because most of the trade takes place in the case of industrial commodities in which the developed countries do have a comparative advantage and many developing countries find it very difficult to compete in the global trading network. Further, the demand for developing countries' traditional export is low relative to the demand for the industrial commodities. That is, the problem now facing developing countries is not much whether to trade, but on what commodities to trade. So, international trade will obviously provide gains for every country, and they will be much better off than the alternative, that is, buying and selling goods restricted to their domestic market alone. So, there is no alternative for trade. That is why we can quote the words of Horn and Gomez when they argue that international trade renders benefit to all participating countries or participating nations and it causes injury to none. Now let us shift our focus to trade theory and the process of economic development. According to the traditional comparative advantage theory, each country should specialize in the production of commodities in which it is having a comparative advantage. We have already explored the doctrine of comparative advantage in one of our earlier video sessions. You can refer to that. When there is specialization on the basis of comparative advantage, then world output would be greater, and through trade, each country will share a gain as far as increase in world output is concerned through international trade and resultant specialization. But this theory prescribes that the developing countries should continue to specialize on primary production of the primary commodities and the export of raw materials and food to the developed countries in exchange for the manufactured goods. It implies that developing countries should be focusing on primary commodities in exchange for the manufactured import from the developed countries. But this specialization and trade relegates the developing countries to a subordinate position compared to that of developed countries. And as a result, most of the dynamic benefit of industry and trade will accrue to the developed countries, leaving developing countries poor, underdeveloped as well as dependent. That is why there is an influential minority of economists who do argue that the standard international comparative advantage theory was completely irrelevant as far as developing countries are concerned and their development process. They argue that these theory, the comparative advantage theory, is basically a static theory, and it involves an adjustment in the existing condition where the process of development requires a changing of the existing condition. However, it can be argued that the traditional comparative advantage theory can be extended to incorporate the changes in factor supplies, technology and taste by the technique of the comparative statics. As developing country accumulates more capital, it improves technology, its comparative advantage can shift away from the primary commodities to the manufactured goods. That is, the dynamic benefit from industry can be theoretically incorporated into the original calculation of comparative advantage and the subsequent changes in the comparative advantage as well. That is as far as the trade theory and economic development is concerned. Now we are looking at trade as an engine of growth. During the 19th century, most of the world's industrial production was concentrated in the Great Britain. The large increase in the industrial production and population in a basically resource-poor country like Britain led to rapidly rising demand for raw materials and food from what is known as regions of recent settlements. And which are these countries? They are the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Uruguay, as well as South Africa. The stimulus was provided by their rapidly expanding export and then spread to the rest of the economy through the new settled land. That is, these countries were able to meet the growing demand for food and raw materials from Great Britain, and the export sector acted as a leading sector. That is why, according to the Next, in his 1970 work, The Pattern of Trade and Development, Next points out that the export sector was the leading sector that propelled these economies into rapid growth and development. That is, international trade functioned as an engine of growth in the case of regions of recent settlements. Though the regions of recent settlements were able to satisfy Britain's growing demand for food and raw materials. How? Because there are a number of highly favorable internal conditions as far as these countries are concerned. Because these countries were richly endowed with natural resources such as fertile land, forest and abundance of mineral deposits. Further, the workers with various skills moved in large numbers from overpopulated Europe to basically empty lands. So did the huge amount of capital. That is, there took place an inflow of labor along with the capital. So highly skilled laborers are coming into these regions of recent settlements. Then they also bring a lot of capital. So this huge inflow of capital along with the skilled workers made possible the construction of basic economic infrastructure like roads, rails, canals and other facilities that allowed the opening up of new supply sources of food and raw materials to Great Britain. Along with this, there was great improvement on sea transportation that allowed these new lands to satisfy the rising demand for food and raw materials from Great Britain more cheaply than other traditional sources of supply from Europe and other countries of the world. So these are highly favorable conditions. Thus, all the ingredients were present for rapid economic growth of these regions of recent settlements like US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Uruguay as well as South Africa. The demand for their products was rising because of the rapidly rising demand from the Great Britain, and they could exploit this rise in demand with highly favorable internal condition. That is why some economists, most notably Kravis, who points out that these highly favorable internal conditions played a crucial role. That is, these favorable internal condition was main proponent of economic growth of these countries, and trade played only a supportive role. That is, trade did not act as an engine of growth, rather it was the highly favorable internal condition according to the argument of Kravis. Now, a question obviously emerges. Why international trade did not act as an engine of growth in the case of presently developing countries? Because still many developing countries are exporting primary commodities, and we do have a situation in 19th century when a few countries who were concentrated on the export of the primary commodities, the raw materials, food, were benefited they enjoyed trade as an engine of growth. So how trade did not act as an engine of growth in the case of developing countries? Now let us analyze this particular issue. It is generally agreed that today's developing countries can rely much less on trade for their growth and development process. This is because due to less favorable as demand as well as supply condition. On the demand side, it is pointed out that the demand for food and raw materials is growing much less rapidly today than in the case of regions of recent settlements during the 19th century. We will examine that part a little bit later. On the supply side, most of the today's developing countries are much less endowed with the natural resources compared to the regions of recent settlements in 19th century. Now let us explore these two factors a little bit detail. Let us examine first the demand aspect. What are the reasons for the sluggish demand as far as raw materials and food is concerned? The first issue is that the income elasticity of demand for the export of food and raw materials is less than 1. We know that in our microeconomic course, most of the food and raw materials we call it as necessary goods, and these necessary goods have an income elasticity of demand of less than 1. Which imply that as income rises, the demand for the export of developing countries will increase only less than proportionately. That is, the demand for export of developing countries increases proportionately less than the increases in income. That is, as world income increases, the benefit of this increased income will reach mostly to the developed countries and less to the developing countries, because the income elasticity of demand for commodities exported by the developing countries are less than 1. Because most of the commodities, primary commodities, raw materials do have necessary category, and necessary goods have income elasticity of demand less than 1. That's the first and perhaps the most important reason for the sluggishness in the demand for raw materials as well as food. The second aspect is the development of synthetic substitutes that reduce the demand for natural raw materials exported by the developing countries. The third one was the technological advances that took place in the developed countries was mostly raw material saving innovation. When industrialized countries and developed countries began to undertake raw material saving innovation, it reduced the demand for raw materials from the developing countries. Further, the output of services with lower raw material requirement has grown much faster in the developed countries, again dampening the prospect for demand for raw materials and food from the developing countries. And finally, developed countries has imposed a lot of trade restriction, especially on food grains like wheat, vegetables, etc., on the many export of developing countries. That also reduced demand for raw materials and food, or those commodities which are exported from the developing countries. So these are the demand side reason for the low demand as far as food and raw material, or the quantity exported or the products exported by the developing countries. Now let us shift our focus to the supply side reason. The first reason is that most of the today's developing countries are much less endowed with the natural resources than were the regions of recent settlements. We already saw that the regions of recent settlements have a number of highly favorable internal conditions. They were basically empty lands with abundance of natural resources, raw materials, and highly fertile land. But compared to that, today's developing countries are much less endowed with natural resources. Second aspect is that most of the developing countries are overpopulated, so that most of the increase in their output in the food and raw materials are absorbed domestically rather than exported. That means these countries were unable to export because there is a huge domestic demand available. They have to meet a large chunk of population. Thirdly, the international flow of capital to most developing countries today is relatively much less compared to that of the regions of recent settlements, even after the massive inflow of foreign capital after 1990s. Today, the developing countries seems to face an outflow of skilled labor rather than inflow. We have already seen that in the case of regions of recent settlements, there were inflow of skilled labor along with the inflow of capital. On the contrary, today's developing countries are experiencing an outflow of skilled labor. And finally, the developing countries most often neglected their agriculture sector, with the premise that industrialization will provide more stimulants to economic progress, economic growth. They basically neglected their agriculture sector, thus hampering their export as well as development prospects. So these are the supply side reasons. Even though international trade cannot be in general expected to be as an engine of growth in the case of present day developing countries, still there are many ways through which international trade can contribute to economic growth as far as today's developing countries are concerned. Hepperler has pointed out some of the beneficial effects that international trade can have on economic development, specifically in that case of developing countries. The first issue is that, or the first contribution is that, trade can lead to fuller utilization of otherwise unemployed domestic resources in the developing countries. Because of lack of demand, insufficient domestic demand, resources are not fully utilized in the developing country. Once this economy starts trading with other countries, it can move towards more efficient production process. It can move towards an efficient point in the production possibility curve. Rather than producing at an inefficient production point inside its production possibility curve, it can move towards the production possibility frontier, and trade represent as will enable this country for a fuller utilization of what is otherwise the unemployed resources. Or in other words, trade represents a vent for surplus or an outlet for otherwise potential underutilized commodities. So it can provide an outlet, a market where its commodities can be sold. So once your market size is expanded, the country can produce more, and it can lead to fuller utilization of unemployed resources. So that's the first aspect through which international trade can contribute towards development process of at the present day developing countries. The second issue is that by expanding the size of market, trade makes it possible greater production, and as a result of it, division of labor and economies of scale. This is especially important in the production of light manufacturing sector, when the small economies at their initial stages of development might enjoy. And international trade obviously is a vehicle for the transmission of new ideas, new technology, and new managerial and other skills. Trade also stimulates the facilities of international flow of capital. We have already examined another video on how international flow of capital can take place and what are the motives behind it. We have seen that as a result of international trade, as a result of the presence of multinational corporation, when a country opens its economy for a liberalized trade, trade can facilitate international flow of capital from a developed country to the developing country. And when there is a flow of capital, specifically foreign direct capital, the inflow of foreign capital is likely to be accompanied by foreign skilled labor as well, which will have a positive effects on the entire economy. Further, in several large developing countries, for example, India was an example, Brazil was an example, the importation of the manufactured products from the developed country has stimulated the domestic demand until an efficient domestic production of these goods become feasible. Finally, international trade is an excellent anti-monopoly weapon because it stimulates greater efficiency by domestic producers to meet tough foreign competition. So, along with these benefits, obviously there are certain alleged harmful effects of international trade as well. And most important effect obviously is the deterioration of the terms of trade when a country embraces the trade liberalization process. We'll examine this concept detail in our coming videos. The analysis of international trade and economic development would remain incomplete without the analysis of the terms of trade or the relative price at which the countries trade, which will be the theme of our next presentation. Hope that this video is useful to you. You can always visit our blog www.skpeco.blogspot.in for additional learning resources. So until we meet next time, stay safe, happy learning. Thank you.